If you don't know much about ancient philosophy, but you want to learn more, this is the video for you. I asked an expert in ancient philosophy to give me his top 5 book recommendations for someone completely new to the topic. Not only did he give me 5 specific books, but he also told me how the ideas in these books connect with Christian philosophy. The expert who joined me is Dr. Caleb Cohoe, a professor of philosophy at Metropolitan State University Denver. Before launching into his book list, I asked him to describe what ancient philosophy is all about, and here's what he said.
When people say ancient philosophy, usually what they mean is ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, which is what I teach and am an expert in. And that really goes from the beginnings, the first theories of the universe and our place in it that pre-Socratic philosophers came up with about 600 or 700 BC, all the way through the end of the Roman Empire. So Augustine is sort of seen as the end of ancient philosophy. It's really interesting because it goes from this very early period right through to the beginning and rise of Christianity and the interaction of Christianity with philosophy. So there's a lot going on. And by the end of the period, they're referring to Plato and Aristotle as the ancients.
Next, Dr. Cohoe got right into his top 5 book recommendations on ancient philosophy. Here's his list.
I'm going to be presenting them chronologically because I think that makes sense for ancient philosophy, especially since so much of it builds on and is responding to earlier figures. My number 1 pick is not that controversial. I'm going to be starting with Plato and specifically the Socratic dialogues. You can get from Hackett for like $10 this thing called Five Dialogues that features the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, the Meno, and the Phaedo. And those really present the historical Socrates, are written around the time of his life and death. And they give you a sense of what a transformative figure he was. For Christians, it's interesting to see this person who doesn't write anything down, goes around attacking the authorities of his day and questioning what it means to live a good life, and then is eventually killed for that. But his disciples, Plato chief among them, then defend his legacy. There are some interesting things in there for Christians in particular. One part of the Euthyphro that's often highlighted: how can we give back to God if God is the source of all things? If piety is some kind of service to the gods, how does that even make sense? So I think Socrates is already working through some of these puzzles that are really important for Christian theology. Number 2, we're continuing with Plato and going to the Republic, maybe the greatest work of philosophy ever written, and which most scholars agree is not so much presenting the views of the historical Socrates as using Socrates in conversation with Plato's brothers, who are the main interlocutors and characters in the dialogue, Glaucon and Erymanthus, to examine what it would take for a person to be just and for a city to be just. And there's a lot of important and influential things in there in basically every field of philosophy. There's epistemology, there's metaphysics, there's a whole theory of education. If you've ever gotten mad at all the math you had to do growing up, a big part of that goes back to Plato and Plato's Academy, and his conviction that mathematics was good for the soul. One thing I want to highlight for Christians particularly that isn't always talked about as much is there's a really important passage at the end of Book 2 of the Republic where they're talking about what kind of stories are going to be allowed in the city and in their education. And Socrates attacks Homer and the poets specifically for what they say about a god or the gods. The gods are presented as the source of both good and evil. But there, Socrates argues really strongly that God has to only be the source of good, can never be the source of evil, and that God must be unchanging, since any change would be for the worse. So that's a theme that will really be picked up later, both by pagan philosophers such as Plotinus and by Augustine and other Christian philosophers. And it's really important for the perfect being theology tradition. Number 3, we're going to go to Aristotle, Plato's student at the academy, and then started his own place, and the thinker I've worked the most on. Now, Aristotle is a little trickier because he has a highly technical vocabulary and definitely somewhere where you can benefit from taking a class and not just reading. But I think his Nicomachean ethics is accessible. It is intended for a broader, more public audience, and it's one of the key foundation texts for the idea of virtue ethics, that human flourishing requires the virtues, requires developing excellences of character through habituation and intellectual excellences through learning. And it's also really important in the history of Christian theology for this distinction it makes between the contemplative and the practical life, between whether your life is mainly involved at contemplating and understanding the highest things, or whether it's more a life of service to your community and those around you. Aristotle thinks both of those lives are valuable, but he has extensive arguments for thinking that the contemplative and philosophical life is the best. Surprise, surprise. And then that has an influence on Christian theology later when there's a discussion about what kind of balance there should be between a life of Christian service versus a life of trying to deepen on theological understanding of God, a life of prayer and contemplation. And those themes and conflicts show up in a lot of different Christian traditions, and people are often drawing on this distinction that's there in Aristotle. For my last two selections, we're going to move a little forward in time from Athens to the Roman world. So after Aristotle in the Hellenistic period, there are two big schools that have an influence and are really aimed at everyone. So Aristotle is a bit of an elitist. He doesn't think everyone can flourish. He thinks, in fact, all of society should be set up so that the very best can live the best lives and everyone else just supports them. But these two new schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans, they have the conviction that through following their way of life and understanding their vision of the world, anyone can live well. And they both start in Greece in the generation after Aristotle, but the two works I've selected are actually from the Roman period. First, we have Lucretius representing the Epicureans on the nature of things, which is actually a Latin poem written in the first century and one before Christ, and one of the most important earlier Latin poems, where he's going to make the case for the Epicurean view, but he said he's going to put some honey on the medicine to make it go down easy. So there's lots of beautiful images, and the really interesting thing I think for Christians is to see how he deals with death and the gods, because those are the two big things that Epicureans think mess up our life. For them, the biggest problem is our kind of emotional and psychological disturbances. And they think, with some reason, that a lot of that is caused by fear of death and fear that the gods might be punishing you or your neighbors or attacking. And I think there's something to that. But then also, obviously, from the Christian perspective, they're missing something, but it's their critiques of religion and superstition are really interesting and influential. Really, the climax of the book is a depiction of the plague in Athens and just how awful everything is. And the Epicurean advice is just try to minimize pain, try to not think about bad things, live the best life that you can with very moderate needs. And then in a way, I'll go to the fifth. The Stoics go even further by saying it's not about pleasure and avoiding pain the way the Epicureans thought it was. Instead, the good life just consists in choosing well and being virtuous, whatever happens to you externally. And this, in the Greek Stoics, is formulated as living according to nature. But one of the most influential Stoics, and the one I picked for the fifth book, is Epictetus, who writes in Greek, but he's an ex-slave living and teaching in Rome. And he's a man who has gone through hardship. His master broke his leg because he got angry at him once. So he's not someone just telling you to push through it when he's never had to work a day in his life. He really has gone through everything. And his advice is you have to only focus on what's up to you, on your inner choices, and everything else you're just going to accept. The way that others react, you're going to prepare for their possible negative reactions. If you're going out, you're going to prepare for there to be traffic and unpleasant things happening to you. And that's how you sort of live in accordance with the divine reason or plan, which he calls Zeus, but he often talks about in a very paternal and very, fatherly and personal terms in ways that to some extent would be picked up in Christian theology. And then there's an interesting question about the Stoics do already, although they're materialists and they have an idea of God as this kind of force pervading the universe, But they do have this idea of that force as governing all things. And that does come into interaction with Christian ideas of providence. And the Stoics and Epicureans are also the two philosophies that were predominant at the beginning of the Christian era.
That list gets you directly into the primary sources, but ancient philosophers can be hard to understand. So I asked Dr. Cohoe if he could recommend some additional books to help along the way. He gave me 5, and here they are.
One project that I think is quite accessible and relevant to your readers is this series from Oxford, edited by my friend Stephen Graham, called Guides to the Good Life. And they have an Epicurean volume that my friend Emily Austin did, Living for Pleasure, an Epicurean Guide to the Good Life. So that series, they're short, 10 to 15 page chapters, and it's explaining the overall philosophy and then how it applies to life in a bunch of different areas. So there's one already for the Epicureans. They have a bunch of different traditions. Not all of ancient philosophy is covered yet, but that would be something to look out for. Specifically in the case of Aristotle, there's a good overview of his thought called Aristotle, The Desire to Understand by Jonathan Barnes. And in the case of ethics specifically, Ethics with Aristotle by Sarah Brody, where she's an ancient philosopher, but also trying to see, like, what do you need to change, what works, what doesn't. And then I'll do 2 final honorable mentions. One as an example of ancient philosophy scholarship that I think is both quite good and engaging and easy to read, even though I disagree with some of it, is a book called A Free Will by Michael Freda. And it's about the history of the concept of free will and making the case that it's not really there in Aristotle, and it's only to some extent the earlier Stoics, but especially the later Stoics, like Roman Stoics, like Epictetus, and some early Christian thinkers, and then finally Augustine, who comes forward with this view. So it's a combination of a history of ideas, but then also getting into these people's thought and how it relates to contemporary discussions of the soul. And then for an overall evaluation and critique of ancient philosophy, I think book 19 of The City of God by Augustine it's Augustine's kind of on the boundary of ancient and medieval. I decided not to put anything from him in here, but I'm going to put that in there as an honorable mention because it both kind of gives you an overview of what these different schools were and then why Augustine thinks they all fall short. So I think he's a little harsher there on philosophy than he is elsewhere. And I've got some things to say there, but I think that's especially for those who are interested in how Christians interact with these schools, that's worth looking at. That's book 19 out of 22. And you can just start right in book 19. You don't have to make it through books 1 to 18 to profitably read that.
A lot of ancient philosophy focuses on how to live the good life, how to live well. And this naturally leads into questions in the field of ethics. If you want to hear another expert give their top 5 book recommendations on ethics, then click this video to keep exploring.